Well, Ed, we've had a busy morning this morning, from sort of dealing with Donald Trump to the impact on Australia of a whole lot of uncertainty in Asia. But now your team at Bloomberg, you're used to making instant decisions about what's newsworthy in events like this, and you have to get something on the wire, on the screen in a matter of minutes. So what have you got up there now?
Well, that's right, Greg. I've got to say I was a little bit jealous of you watching you eat lunch when I had to dash downstairs and make sure that we were pumping some stories out to the wire. Obviously, I'm biased at Bloomberg. I can't go past the economic story and the panel discussion that we had just before lunch, which I've got to say was decidedly bearish about the outlook for global growth and the impact of potentially a full-blown trade war and the ramifications for Australia. Sally Old revealed that JP Morgan's building in a scenario of 25% tariffs across the full suite of Chinese exports to the US. That's more than $500 billion worth of exports. And they're estimating that will wipe about a percentage point of China GDP next year. Interestingly, Bloomberg economists are building in a base scenario of about 1.5 percentage points wiped off, so a little bit more bearish there. Heather Ridout panned out to look at the possibilities of a recession in the US as the Fed potentially overshoots, while Chris Bowen told us he was concerned about animal spirits, a phrase we haven't heard for a while, if the trade skirmish becomes a full-blown trade war. And Sally concluded the panel by saying that it would be really hard for Australia, which has enjoyed 27 years of recession-free growth, to duck and weave the next global slowdown. So for us, that's exactly the kind of stories that Bloomberg clients need to read, and they need that finger on the pulse commentary on what's happening in the global economy.
And is that up on the screen now, or are you still working on it?
I have to say, I did take a little bit of time to have a bit of food, which delayed it slightly, but it will be up there shortly. Okay. What about you? What have you been cogitating over?
Well, we've got a bit more time at Asia Briefing, a bit more time to get down to thinking about what we're going to publish, and I've sort of got a few bigger picture ideas about takeaways from what we've heard at breakfast and then this morning. I was particularly struck by the conversation at breakfast this morning with Nainan and Mingxin about the outlook for the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative. I think here in Australia we're split in a sort of binary way about the BRI. I think there's a sense in parts of the business community that this is a saviour for the resources industry if we can export iron ore into China as part of the BRI or the broader region. And then there's another school of thought that sees the BRI as a really major threat to regional security as China extends its power across the region via the mechanism of the BRI. Now, I think this morning we've got a much more middle-of-the-road sort of take from our two guest speakers, who really don't really fit into either of those camps. They tend to think the BRI is not going to go very well, that China's overextended, it can't really afford to back all these projects, and a lot of these projects won't make much money anyway. And so it's actually perhaps more of a burden for China than a big sort of economic and strategic plus. So I thought that was quite interesting. The second thing that flowed on a bit from breakfast but flowed on into the economist panel was this quite interesting idea that's evolving now about the world splitting once again in a binary way between the US and China over technology. Now, I think we saw Sally Auld talk about the idea of there being two payment systems and two internets. I think we saw Mark Whelan at breakfast this morning from ANZ talking a little bit about how would the financial institutions like his cope with that sort of system. But I think the most striking thing from the breakfast session was that Mingxin is talking not about a binary system, two systems. He's talking about the world perhaps splitting into 4 or 5 sort of tech-based systems, 4 or 5 payment systems, 4 or 5 internet or e-commerce systems. It's a much bigger challenge than the binary system that we've mostly been talking about so far. And then Nainan was talking about the idea of India as the rising third economic power in the world, trying to cope with this. India's got a strong technology base and has a big population to pump out to get scale from new technology. And he's sort of toying with the idea that India can sort of survive this binary system and have its own sort of tech ecosystem. So I think that's a really interesting sort of take on this idea of the world dividing in a simple way.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're potentially looking at a balkanization
Yes.
of the internet and the global trading order that we've grown used to. And when you weave in issues around cybersecurity as well, then it really could pose some serious hurdles to global trade.
Yes, and it seems to be more multifaceted than the idea of just a US-China sort of showdown, which is interesting. Now, just a sort of out of left field sort of idea that I thought was very interesting, once again came from Ninan's introductory speech to the Economist session, where I think he would have struck fear into the hearts of the Australian farm community. In fact, when I tweeted his comments about this, and I tried to link in a couple of farm organisations trying to have a bit of impact. So, but I think his idea that India is now exporting as much in value terms as Australia exports in agricultural produce is going to be quite a shocking idea to the Australian agricultural sector, because I think our farmers see India as the next great export market if we can just get some sort of trade agreement up. We've struggled to do that, and we're not making much progress. But nonetheless, I think that's the one of the sort of simple ways that we view India here in Australia. His idea that India is now able to perhaps increase its exports at a greater value level than Australia is than Australia will. I think really raises some interesting questions about how we really should see India. And I think the idea in the Varghese report that the government has in its hands now about trying to look beyond pure sort of simple export-import relationship with India to something broader is something that will gain more force from his idea that India is actually an agricultural exporter rather than an importer of Australian products.
I think we'll have the opportunity to explore that a little bit in the business panel. You know, and we're talking to the likes of Mark Whelan, sitting patiently in the front row there. You know, obviously agribusiness is a big part of the picture, and potentially a big part of the business for ANZ Bank's institutional business as they support clients in the region. So, noted. Want to ask you about, Mark. Yeah, I was really struck as well by really how scathing Ninan and Minchin were about the Belt and Road Initiative over breakfast. Ninan highlighted how just about every country that's joined is experiencing problems, and the poster child of that being Sri Lanka, which has just had to sort of sign over its port for 99 years. Minchin went even farther and suggested that the whole initiative refutes the conventional wisdom that China has a well-thought-through strategy to increase its global power, and said that it's really just one man's pet project that hadn't been robustly road-tested enough. The Belt and Road is dying, he said, and China simply doesn't have enough resources to finish it, which is commentary that I'd not heard before, and we'll certainly be pursuing that as a feature to write in the coming days, I think.
Sure. What, Edward, what do people want to read about Australia on you've got the instant data at Bloomberg. What sort of things are people reading about?
Let me flip it round, and instead of talking about what our global readers want to read about Australia, let's talk about what people just want to read on the Bloomberg in general, and what Australians want to read. Because one of the value propositions we bring is our global perspective. We find that our readers just have a voracious appetite for the biggest market-moving news. You know, in Australia, they want to wake up and they want to know what moved Wall Street, whether it's the latest comments from Trump on the China trade war, whether it's coverage of the most significant US companies like Facebook and Amazon, or whether it's political developments ahead of the midterm elections. In terms of what people want to read about Australia, we obviously have to cover this market for our terminal clients in Australia. We have to get close to the coalface and provide a granular level of coverage. But we've also got to step back, take that 30,000-foot approach, and make sense of Australia for the global audience. Time and time again, our biggest story is really the economy story. You know, GDP, CPI, jobs, very, very closely watched. The impact on the Aussie dollar being the world's 5th most traded currency. That's pretty much our bread and butter here, along with markets coverage. And of course, we're still viewed very much as a proxy for China. So anything we can write that provides that prism, that look into the Chinese economy is also very popular.
Right.
So, Greg, one of the great aspects, I think, from the briefing today has been the audience participation, and we've been able to take the pulse of the guests in the room with the polling questions. We will be conducting some more, myself and Greg, later on in this little session, so do have your devices ready. Greg, what have we seen so far from the polls?
Well, the first poll this morning, as quite a lot of people here will know, we were expecting perhaps a few more people to come in now to see the Prime Minister, but I think the wave's going to happen later. But so anyway, we kicked off the question about really rising Chinese power in Southeast Asia and the Pacific. I think that was quite a well-timed question in retrospect because of Bill Shorten's speech on Monday, where he outlined the idea of a Australian-backed infrastructure lending institution of some sort to provide soft finance or maybe commercial finance to Pacific countries, and that's something that's been sort of building as an issue this year with the US beefing up its Overseas Private Investment Corporation lending institution, which is sort of a model Bill Shorten might be thinking about. He didn't provide much detail, I must say, but and Australia and Japan and the US have talked about cooperation in this area. So, but we haven't heard that much about how the current Australian government is going to actually implement that so far. But so that poll really showed that. Well, it was split pretty clearly. It was an overwhelming result, really, with 90% of people saying we should accept China's rising power and try and work with it. So I think that probably suggests we sort of have to work out some way to work with Chinese, the BRI in the Pacific, perhaps. And
that reflected the business and diplomatic interests in the room.
Well, yeah, it probably did. It probably did, I guess. But that was a fairly clear-cut result, I think. So, yes. So, and now. The next poll, I think, Ed, was...
Yeah, the next poll was the impact of an escalating trade war on the Australian economy. And again, you know, quite split. I think we had about 32% catastrophic, which is quite a strong term. Surprising, actually, that 32% believed it could be as damaging as that. And then the vast majority, then 68%, thought limited damage. Interestingly, nobody thought that Australia would come out unscathed. Yes. So maybe they were influenced by those very bearish comments we had from our panellists, Sally Old and Heather Ridout there. Are we going to move on to our audience polling?
I think we probably should, if everyone's ready. So, okay. Well, now I think now on Monday we saw a quite remarkable example of the spooks coming out from behind the curtain with the new head, or the relatively new head of the Australian Signals Directorate, Mike Burgess, revealing quite a lot of information about why the government decided not to really allow the Chinese companies Huawei and ZTE Corp to participate in the development of Australia's 5G telecommunications network. This sort of development of infrastructure has become a big issue over the last year, but it probably really kicked off when Scott Morrison, who we're going to see this afternoon, as Treasurer, rejected the bid by State Grid and CK Infrastructure from Hong Kong, rejected them buying the New South Wales power company Ausgrid. And that sort of kicked off a lot more public debate about how to manage Australia's infrastructure. So this question, I think, which is coming up now, really addresses that. Huawei was banned from rolling out 5G across Australia. Now we've got CKI Group bidding for the APA gas pipeline assets. And this government will have to make a decision about that soon. Will be interesting to see whether they make that decision before the Prime Minister goes off on the round of summits coming up in the next month. But it really raises the basic threshold question of, is Australia open for business?
It's interesting results, and it surprises me, actually. I thought that...
Right,
sure. It's bouncing around. Don't let me influence you, know, in how you respond. Yeah, well, maybe, yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, it is, that's right.
Vindicates the government. We shall share those results with the Prime Minister when he arrives within the hour. I'm sure he'll be delighted that he's got a friendly audience. Our next question, we definitely will share with the Prime Minister. If we could pull that one up, and I'll talk around some of the context of why we're asking this as you answer. How would you, as the audience, rate the Australian government's management of its relationship with China? And just to clarify, when I say Australian government, I'm talking about the multiple governments that we've had since 2013, Abbott, Turnbull, and now Prime Minister Morrison. And it's ranging from A, total mismanagement. Oh, dear. Oh, no, good. Clumsy and inconsistent. C, pass. Good considering the circumstances, and superb handling. Obviously, this decision that we're going to get within a few weeks, maybe within a few months, on CKI's bid for APA is potentially a watershed moment, and it will really give a strong indication as to whether or not the slightly protectionist instincts that Treasurer Scott Morrison took are going to continue now he's actually in the top job. And these decisions are so closely watched by Beijing. When State Grid was barred from buying Ausgrid, that prompted an immediate backlash from the Commerce Ministry in Beijing. The Foreign Ministry said when Huawei and ZTE were barred from the 5G network that it was, quote, gravely concerned about the political biases behind the decision. Ties had been decidedly frosty in recent months. There appeared to be a freeze in ministerial visits after Prime Minister Turnbull pushed back against meddling in the media and universities. But perhaps there are more reasons to be optimistic now about that relationship. The new Foreign Minister, Maurice Payne, has met with a Chinese counterpart already, and now all eyes are on whether Trade Minister Simon Birmingham will go to the Shanghai Expo, which I believe is next week.
I think he is going, yes. Yes, so I think that's quite an interesting step forward. Tell you a little anecdote about the Shanghai Expo that I sort of came across a couple of weeks ago. There was a group of Chinese journalists here visiting in Australia and sponsored by DFAT under the Special Visitor Program, I think. And Asia Society held an event early on in the week when they were here in Sydney. And I sort of expected to be a wide-ranging discussion about all the sorts of things you'd expect them to maybe be talking about: the South China Sea, Australian student flow, Chinese student flow to Australia, that sort of wide range of issues. There's plenty of stuff to talk about, and I think everyone came a bit prepared to have a wide-ranging sort of discussion. I think we were quite surprised to find that these journalists, who were quite high-end, mostly all business and economic journalists from Chinese publications, quite knowledgeable on a wide range of issues, but they really wanted to zero in on what Australia was doing about the Expo in Shanghai. And we were a bit surprised. I hadn't really focused on the Expo in Shanghai, to be honest. But they really were interested. They wanted to know whether the minister was going. They wanted to know what we were doing, and they wanted to sort of talk about how good it was. They'd clearly sort of been primed somehow by the system in China to come here and come back with some sort of a reporting about what Australia was doing about this big event. I think it really underlined the fact that there seems to be some shift in the Chinese system to really trying to be a bit more attempting to look a bit more accommodating to foreign business, I think, in the wake of this conflict with the US, and the sense operating conditions on the ground for foreign businesses in China are getting harder. Some of our Australian exporters, particularly food, the health product exporters have had trouble getting through the Chinese regulatory system. So I think they want a big participation in the Expo, but they also want to try and use the Expo to say that China is open to foreign business. So we'll see what really happens next week.
All eyes on the start of this conference season.
Yes,
the East
that's
Asia
right.
Summit in APEC and
yes.
the G20.
Yes. That really is the new agenda for the Prime Minister, and maybe he'll flesh that out a bit more when Heidi gets to talk to him, what he's going to do at each of those three summits coming up. The East Asia Summit in Singapore, High Commissioner, I think on the 15th of November, yeah, and followed by the APEC in Port Moresby on 17th, 18th, 19th, and then the G20 in Argentina on November 30. So it's a busy summit season, and I think we'll see we'll see a lot more of the Prime Minister talking about these foreign issues after today.
That's great. Well, thank you, Greg, for joining me. It was a pleasure trying to provide a synopsis of this morning's session, and I look forward to reading your takeaways in the next edition of Asia Briefing.
Well, I'll look forward to reading Bloomberg, but I have to get beyond the paywall.
Get beyond the paywall. It's well worth it. It's well worth it. All of our dedicated readers would tell you that.
Okay, thanks very much.
Thanks very much.